The fluorescent lights in the glass-walled conference room felt like an interrogation spotlight. Marcus Chen sat with his hands folded on the polished mahogany table, his janitorial uniform a stark contrast to the expensive suits across from him. Richard Castellano, vice president of operations, leaned back in his leather chair with the satisfied expression of a man who had already written the ending to this story. Beside him, Jennifer Walsh from Human Resources kept her eyes on her tablet, her finger occasionally swiping as if she were checking off boxes on an execution checklist. "Do you understand the severity of what we're discussing, Mr. Chen?" Richard's voice was smooth, practiced, the kind of tone that came from years of delivering bad news without losing sleep over it. Medical equipment worth over $50,000 has gone missing from the executive floor. Equipment that requires both access and knowledge to steal. And you, unfortunately, have both. Marcus felt his throat tighten. The words he wanted to say, the defense he wanted to mount, all of it stuck somewhere between his chest and his mouth. His mind was racing, but his tongue felt like lead. "I didn't take anything," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I clean those floors. That's all I do." Jennifer finally looked up from her tablet, her expression a careful mask of professional sympathy that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Chen, we've reviewed the security footage from the night of August 15th. Your cart was parked outside the medical supply room on the 42nd floor at 11:23 post-meridium. You were alone on that floor for approximately 47 minutes. The equipment was inventoried that morning and discovered missing the following day." Marcus's hands clenched together tighter. August 15th. He remembered that night. How could he forget? But he couldn't tell them why he was there, why he'd been on that floor for so long, the promise he'd made, the privacy he'd sworn to protect. It bound him as surely as chains. "I was cleaning," he repeated, knowing how weak it sounded. "That's my job. I clean the 42nd floor every Tuesday and Thursday night." Richard leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his fingers steepled in front of his face. "Mr. Chen, let's be frank. We've looked into your background. You're a single father raising twin 7-year-olds on a janitor's salary. Your daughter, Emma, had an emergency room visit 4 months ago. Asthma attack, wasn't it? Those bills don't pay themselves. Your son, Ethan, needs glasses. You're 3 months behind on your rent." Each fact landed like a physical blow. Marcus felt his face burning with shame. They had dissected his life, examined his struggles like specimens under a microscope, and found him wanting. Found him desperate, found him guilty. "Financial pressure makes people do things they wouldn't normally do," Richard continued, his voice taking on a false note of understanding. "We're not without compassion here. If you return the equipment, we can possibly avoid involving the police. We could frame this as a termination for cause rather than a criminal matter. Think about your children, Mr. Chen. Think about what a criminal record would mean for them." The mention of Emma and Ethan sent a spike of panic through Marcus's chest. His children, his entire world, everything he did, every double shift he worked, every moment of exhaustion he pushed through, it was all for them. They'd already lost their mother. Claire had died 7 years ago, her body giving out just hours after bringing Emma and Ethan into the world. Complications, the doctors had said, a clinical word for a tragedy that had shattered his universe into before and after. He'd been a nurse then, a good one. He'd worked in the emergency room at St. Catherine's Hospital, had been respected, valued, on track for a charge nurse position. But grief had a way of making the world unstable, and when the accident had happened 8 months after Claire's death, when he'd had to make that impossible choice in the trauma bay, everything had fallen apart. The memory was always there, lurking at the edges of his consciousness, the night they'd brought in 6 critical patients from a multi-car pileup. Not enough hands, not enough time, not enough resources. He'd triaged according to protocol, spending precious minutes on the patients who had the best chance of survival. But one of the patients he'd designated as expectant, the clinical term for too far gone, had been the son of a city councilman. The family had sued everyone, the hospital, the doctors, and most viciously, him. The hospital had settled quickly, throwing Marcus under the bus to protect themselves. His nursing license had been suspended pending investigation, then revoked entirely. The state board had ruled that while he'd technically followed triage protocol, his judgment had been impaired by personal grief. It didn't matter that he'd saved 3 lives that night. It only mattered that he'd lost one that had powerful connections. So he'd become invisible. He'd taken the janitorial job at Hartley Industries because it was the only place that would hire him without asking too many questions. For 5 years, he'd pushed his cart through pristine hallways, cleaned executive bathrooms, emptied trash cans filled with the discarded decisions of people who made more in a day than he made in a year. He'd kept his head down, done his work, and tried to give Emma and Ethan the life they deserved. And now, sitting in this glass box with these people who had already decided his guilt, he felt the weight of every failure crushing down on him. "Mr. Chen," Jennifer said, her voice pulling him back to the present, "we need an answer. Where is the equipment?" "I don't have it," Marcus said, and he heard the defeat in his own voice. "I didn't take it. I swear on my children's lives, I didn't take anything." Richard's expression hardened. "Then you leave us no choice." He nodded to Jennifer, who pressed a button on the desk phone. "Send in security, please." Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. They were going to arrest him. He was going to lose everything: his job, his freedom, his children. Emma and Ethan would end up in the system, separated, lost in the machinery of foster care. The thought was a knife twisting in his gut. The door behind him opened, and he heard the heavy footsteps of the security guards entering. Marcus closed his eyes, trying to memorize the feeling of being free, of being able to go home to his children tonight, to tuck them into bed, and tell them he loved them. "Mr. Chen," Richard began, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "Effective immediately, your employment with Hartley Industries is terminated. You will be escorted from the building, and we will be filing a report with the police department. You have the right to legal representation, and I suggest you exercise that right." Marcus opened his eyes, staring at the table, at his own reflection in the polished wood. He looked like a ghost. He felt like one. The security guard's hand was reaching for his shoulder when the conference room door burst open with a force that made everyone jump. 2 small figures exploded into the room, moving with the chaotic energy of 7-year-olds on a mission. Emma came first, her dark hair flying behind her in a tangled ponytail, her school backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Right behind her was Ethan, his glasses slightly crooked on his face, clutching a tablet to his chest like it was a precious treasure. "Daddy!" Emma shouted, her voice high and fierce. "They're lying! You didn't steal anything!" Marcus's heart stopped, then restarted at triple speed. Emma? Ethan? His mind couldn't process what he was seeing. His children, who were supposed to be safely in the company's on-site daycare center 2 floors down, were standing in the middle of his firing, their faces flushed with exertion and determination. "What in the world?" Richard sputtered, rising from his chair. "Who let these children in here? Security!" But Emma wasn't backing down. She marched right up to the table, her small hands balling into fists. Her eyes, so much like Claire's, blazed with an anger Marcus had never seen in her before. "You can't fire our dad. He's a hero. He saved her." Richard's face twisted with confusion and irritation. "Young lady, this is a private meeting. You need to leave immediately." Ethan stepped forward, holding up the tablet with shaking hands. "We have proof," he said, his voice quieter than his sister's, but no less determined. "We heard Miss Rebecca and Miss Amanda talking in the daycare. They said our dad was being fired for stealing. But that's not true. He was helping someone. He told us about it." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. No. They couldn't know about that night. He'd been so careful. So vague when he'd mentioned it, just a passing comment about helping someone who'd had a bad night, nothing more. He'd never mentioned names, never revealed details. "Kids," he said, his voice cracking, "you need to go back to the daycare. This is grown-up business." But Emma spun to face him, and there were tears streaming down her cheeks now. "No, Daddy. You always tell us to tell the truth, to stand up when something's wrong. You saved that girl. You told us you helped the sad girl who couldn't breathe right. You said she reminded you of Mommy." The room went very still. Marcus felt every eye on him, felt the weight of the revelation settling over the conference table like snow. Jennifer leaned forward, her professional mask slipping slightly. "Mr. Chen, what is she talking about? What girl?" Marcus swallowed hard. He'd made a promise, but looking at his children's faces, at their absolute faith in him, at their willingness to fight for him when he'd given up fighting for himself, he realized that some promises had to be broken. On August 15th, he said slowly, his voice barely steady, I was on the 42nd floor, but I wasn't stealing. I was in CEO Hartley's office because her daughter was dying. The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Richard's expression shifted from irritation to confusion, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to process what Marcus had just said. Jennifer's fingers froze over her tablet. Even the security guards, who had been moving forward to escort the children out, stopped mid-step. What did you just say? Richard's voice was sharp, dangerous. CEO Hartley's daughter? What are you talking about? Marcus felt his hands trembling. He'd kept this secret for 3 weeks, had honored Victoria Hartley's desperate request for privacy, had carried the weight of that night alone. But now, with his children standing before him, their faith in him shining through their tears, he couldn't stay silent anymore. Emma grabbed Ethan's hand, squeezing it tight. Tell them, Daddy, tell them what you told us, about the girl who was scared and couldn't breathe, and how you made her okay again. Marcus took a deep breath, and suddenly he was back in that night, 3 weeks ago, the memory flooding through him with crystalline clarity. It had been 11:15 post-meridium on August 15th. The 42nd floor was always quiet at that hour, just the hum of the air conditioning and the soft squeak of his cart's wheels against the polished marble. He'd been cleaning the executive wing, working his way down the long hallway of corner offices that belonged to the company's top leadership. Victoria Hartley's office was at the end, a massive space with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city's glittering skyline. He'd noticed the light on under her door, which was unusual. The CEO rarely worked past 9 in the evening, and when she did, her assistant always left a note for the cleaning. Crew to come back later. But there was no note tonight, and Marcus had assumed she'd simply forgotten to turn off the lights. He'd knocked softly, a courtesy he always extended even when he was sure an office was empty. No response. He'd knocked again, louder this time, and that's when he heard it. A crash, followed by a low, guttural sound that made every instinct in his body snap to attention. Marcus had opened the door, his hand already reaching for his phone to call security, when he saw her. A teenage girl was on the floor beside the CEO's desk, her body convulsing in violent rhythmic spasms. Her eyes had rolled back in her head, showing only whites, and foam was gathering at the corners of her mouth. Scattered around her were 3 empty prescription bottles and 2 crushed energy drink cans, their contents pooled on the expensive carpet. The world had narrowed to a single point of focus. Marcus's nursing training, dormant for 5 years but never forgotten, roared back to life. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands moving with a speed and certainty that surprised even him. Her airway was compromised. He could see her tongue had fallen back, blocking her throat. He'd tilted her head back, swept his fingers through her mouth to clear it, then turned her onto her side in the recovery position. The seizing continued, her muscles locked in spasm, her fingers curled into rigid claws. Benzos, he'd muttered, grabbing one of the empty bottles. The label read, Sophia Hartley, alprazolam, 2 milligrams. The other bottles were the same medication, all prescribed within the last month, all empty. Sweet God, how many did she take? He'd pulled out his phone with shaking hands and dialed 911. The operator's voice had been calm, professional, asking him questions he answered on autopilot while his hands worked to keep Sophia alive. Is she breathing? The operator asked. Barely. Shallow respirations, maybe 6 per minute. She's seizing. Looks like a benzodiazepine overdose mixed with a massive caffeine intake. Her heart rate's through the roof. Sir, are you medical personnel? I was, Marcus had said, the words tasting like ash. I'm a former ER nurse. I know what I'm doing. The operator had stayed on the line, but Marcus barely heard her after that. His entire focus was on Sophia, on keeping her airway clear, on monitoring her breathing, on talking to her even though he knew she couldn't hear him. Stay with me, sweetheart, he'd murmured, his voice low and steady. You're going to be okay. Help is coming. Just hang on. Think about your mom. Think about everyone who loves you. You're stronger than this. Stay with me. The seizing had begun to slow after what felt like hours, but was probably only 3 or 4 minutes. Her body went limp, and for one heart-stopping moment, Marcus thought she'd stopped breathing entirely. He'd checked her pulse, felt the thready, rapid flutter under his fingers, and positioned himself to start rescue, breathing if needed. But then she'd gasped, a wet, desperate sound, and her chest had started rising and falling with more regularity. Still too shallow, still too slow, but breathing. Marcus had never felt more relieved in his entire life. The paramedics had arrived 8 minutes later, bursting through the office door with their equipment and their practiced efficiency. Marcus had given them a rapid-fire report, medical terminology flowing from his lips, as if the last 5 years had never happened. 16-year-old female, approximately 110 pounds, suspected overdose of alprazolam, estimated 30 to 40 milligrams based on empty bottles, combined with high caffeine intake from energy drinks. Seizure activity for approximately 4 minutes, now resolved. Respirations currently 8 per minute, pulse 130 and thready. Airway cleared and maintained, patient in recovery position. The lead paramedic, a woman with kind eyes and gray streaks in her dark hair, had looked at him with something like respect. "You saved her life," she'd said quietly, as they loaded Sophia onto the stretcher. Another few minutes and we'd be dealing with respiratory failure. Marcus had stood there in that devastated office, his hands still shaking with adrenaline as they'd wheeled Sophia away. The police had come next, asking questions, taking statements. He'd told them everything he knew, which wasn't much. He'd been cleaning, heard a noise, found her like this, called 911. He hadn't touched anything except the pill bottles to check the labels and the patient herself to save her life. It was almost 2 a.m. when Victoria Hartley had arrived, her face pale and drawn, still wearing the evening gown from whatever event she'd been attending. She'd listened to the police report with a stony expression, had asked a few quiet questions, and then had turned to Marcus. "Thank you," she'd said, and her voice had cracked on the words. "Thank you for saving my daughter." Marcus had nodded, not knowing what to say. The CEO had looked at him for a long moment, and he'd seen something in her eyes that he recognized. The same desperate fear he'd felt in the delivery room when Claire was bleeding out, when the doctors were shouting orders, when everything was slipping away and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Mr. Chen," Victoria had said softly, once the police had finished and they were alone in her office. "What happened here tonight, my daughter's struggle? This is a private family matter. I know I have no right to ask this of you, but I'm asking anyway. Please don't speak of this to anyone. Sophia is fighting her own battles, and she doesn't need the entire company knowing about her worst moment." Marcus had understood. He'd nodded. "Of course, ma'am, I won't say anything." She'd thanked him again, her composure cracking just slightly, and then she'd been gone, following her daughter to the hospital. The next day, a simple email had appeared in his work inbox from Victoria Hartley. Subject line, "Gratitude." The message had been brief. "Mr. Chen, there are no words sufficient to express my family's gratitude for your actions. Sophia is recovering well, thanks to your quick thinking and medical expertise. As discussed, we appreciate your discretion in this matter. Please know that your kindness will not be forgotten." That had been 3 weeks ago. Marcus had kept his promise, had told no one except, apparently, his children, and even then only in the vaguest of terms. Now, sitting in this conference room with Richard and Jennifer staring at him like he'd grown a second head, Marcus felt the full weight of that night pressing down on him. "That's quite a story, Mr. Chen," Richard said slowly, his eyes narrowed. "But I'm not sure what a supposed medical emergency 3 weeks ago has to do with theft that occurred on the same night." "It wasn't supposed," Ethan said, his quiet voice cutting through the tension like a knife. His fingers were swiping across the tablet screen, his face scrunched in concentration. "It's real, and we can prove it." Jennifer stood up, moving around the table toward the children. "Let me see that," she said, not unkindly, reaching for the tablet. But Emma stepped in front of her brother, her chin jutting out defiantly. "No. You have to promise you won't fire our dad first. You have to promise he can stay." "Sweetheart," Jennifer said, her professional mask slipping into something softer. "That's not how this works. We need to see what you have, and then we'll make decisions based on the evidence. That's not fair." Emma's voice rose, cracking with emotion. You already decided. You already said he's fired. You didn't even listen to him. Marcus felt his heart breaking. His 7-year-old daughter, who should be worrying about homework and playground games, was standing in a corporate conference room fighting for his job, for their life. He wanted to scoop her up, carry her out of here, shield her from all of this ugliness. Emma, he said gently, it's okay. Let them see. But Daddy? Please, baby, trust me. Let them see. Emma looked at him for a long moment, her lower lip trembling, and then she nodded. She turned to Ethan, who handed the tablet to Jennifer with reluctant, careful hands. Jennifer took it, her eyes scanning the screen. Her expression changed almost immediately, shifting from skepticism to confusion to something that might have been shock. She looked up at Richard, then back at the screen. This is, she started, then stopped. This is the incident report from the night of August 15th. What incident report? Richard demanded, moving to look over her shoulder. From emergency services, 911 call placed at 1117 post meridium from this building, 42nd floor. Caller identification, Marcus Chen, employee. Nature of emergency, overdose and seizure, juvenile female patient. Response time, 8 minutes. Patient transported to Mercy General Hospital, condition critical but stable. The room went very, very quiet. Richard's face had gone pale. He looked at Marcus, then at the tablet, then back at Marcus. You, he started, his voice strained. You called 911 from the CEO's office? Yes, Marcus said simply, and the patient was Sophia Hartley, Marcus confirmed, Victoria Hartley's daughter. She was 16 years old and dying when I found her. Jennifer was already reaching for the conference room phone, her fingers moving with urgent precision. Get me Victoria Hartley, she said into the receiver. I don't care if she's in a meeting. Tell her it's an emergency regarding her daughter and she needs to come to conference room B immediately. Richard's face had shifted from pale to a deep, angry red. Now wait just a minute, he said, his voice rising. Even if this is true, even if Chen did help Miss Hartley's daughter, it doesn't explain why medical equipment went missing that same night. In fact, it makes his access to that supply room even more suspicious. Marcus felt ice flooding his veins. The timing. He'd been so focused on saving Sophia, on keeping his promise to Victoria, that he'd never made the connection. The missing equipment, the night of August 15th, his cart parked outside the medical supply room. Someone had used his presence there, his actions that night, as a smokescreen. Emma grabbed his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his. Daddy didn't take anything, she said, her voice fierce. He was helping. That's what you do. You help people even when nobody's watching. The conference room door opened, and Victoria Hartley entered like a winter storm. She was in her early 40s, tall and commanding in a steel gray suit that probably cost more than Marcus made in 3 months. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her eyes, the same shade as Sophia's, were cold and assessing as they swept the room. Her gaze landed on Marcus, and something flickered across her face. Recognition, perhaps, or concern. Then she saw Emma and Ethan, and her expression softened almost imperceptibly. Someone want to explain why I was pulled out of a board meeting? Victoria's voice was clipped, professional, revealing nothing. And why there are children in this conference room? Richard stood, smoothing his tie with hands that Marcus noticed were shaking slightly. Ma'am, I apologize for the interruption, but there's been a development in the theft investigation. Mr. Chen has made some rather extraordinary claims about events on the night of August 15th, and they involve your daughter. Victoria's face became a mask. She moved to the table, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, and sat down with deliberate grace. I'm listening. Jennifer slid the tablet across to her. Ma'am, the children brought this. It's an incident report from that night. It shows that Mr. Chen placed a 911 call from your office at 1117 post meridium. The report indicates a juvenile female patient with overdose and seizure symptoms. Victoria took the tablet, her eyes scanning the screen. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. When she looked up, her gaze locked onto Marcus with an intensity that made him want to shrink into his chair. Mr. Chen, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Did you break the promise I asked you to keep? No, ma'am, Marcus said quickly. I didn't tell anyone. Not officially. He glanced at his children. I mentioned to my kids that I'd helped someone who was having a hard time. I never used names. I never gave details. They figured it out on their own, Ethan added quietly, pushing his glasses up his nose. When we heard Miss Rebecca say Daddy was being fired for stealing from the 42nd floor, we remembered that night. You came home really late and you were shaking. You hugged us for a really long time, and you said you'd helped a sad girl who reminded you of Mommy. Marcus felt his throat closing up. He didn't remember saying that, but it sounded right. That night had shaken him to his core, had brought back every terrible memory of losing Claire, of standing helpless while someone he cared about slipped away. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her fingers resting on the tablet screen. Then she looked at Richard. Explain to me why saving my daughter's life makes Mr. Chen a theft suspect. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Ma'am, with all due respect, Mr. Chen's actions that night, however admirable, gave him access and opportunity. The medical supply room on the 42nd floor was open that night. A portable ultrasound machine, several cases of controlled medications, and other equipment valued at over $50,000 went missing. The timeline matches exactly with when Mr. Chen was on that floor. Doing CPR on my daughter, Victoria said, her voice dropping several degrees in temperature. Well, yes, but nothing, Richard. Victoria stood, her presence suddenly dominating the room. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. You've built a case against the man who saved Sophia's life based solely on the fact that he was in the right place at the right time to save her? There's the financial motive, Richard pressed on, his voice taking on a desperate edge. Mr. Chen has significant debt, medical bills for his own children. He's behind on rent. People in desperate situations make desperate choices. Marcus watched Victoria's expression shift, saw something dangerous flash in her eyes. She turned to Jennifer. Pull every piece of security footage from the 42nd floor that night, not just the hallway cameras, every camera. Executive offices, supply rooms, stairwells, elevator lobbies, everything. I want a complete timeline of every person who accessed that floor between 10 post-meridium and 2 ante-meridium. Ma'am, Richard interjected, his face flushing. I don't think that's necessary. We already have the relevant footage showing. I don't recall asking for your opinion, Richard. Victoria's voice could have frozen nitrogen. She looked at Jennifer. How long will that take? Jennifer was already typing on her tablet. I can have the security team compile it in 20 minutes. Do it. And while we're waiting, I want to know exactly how this investigation was conducted, who initiated it, who reviewed the evidence, and who decided that the appropriate course of action was immediate termination rather than a thorough investigation. Richard's face went from red to pale again. He sat down heavily, and Marcus saw his hand move unconsciously to his collar, loosening his tie. Ma'am, I was following standard protocol for theft investigations, given the value of the missing equipment and the clear evidence of opportunity. There is nothing clear about any of this, Victoria cut him off. What's clear is that a man who saved my daughter's life is being railroaded out of this company without a proper investigation. She turned to Marcus, and her expression softened almost imperceptibly. Mr. Chen, I owe you an apology. When you kept your promise about Sophia, I never imagined it would be used against you like this. You don't owe me anything, ma'am, Marcus said quietly. I just did what anyone would do. That's where you're wrong, Victoria said, and there was something raw in her voice. Most people would have walked away. Most people would have called security and washed their hands of it. You stayed with her. The paramedics told me that when they arrived, you were talking to her, keeping her calm, keeping her alive. They said your quick thinking and medical knowledge saved her life. So no, Mr. Chen, you didn't do what anyone would do. You did what you were trained to do. And my daughter is alive because of it. Emma squeezed Marcus's hand tighter, and he saw tears streaming down her cheeks. That's what we tried to tell them, she whispered. Daddy's a hero. The conference room door opened, and a security officer entered carrying a laptop. Ma'am, we've compiled the footage you requested. Do you want us to review it here? Yes, Victoria said. Put it up on the main screen. The next 20 minutes were excruciating. They watched the security footage in fast forward, watching Marcus's tiny figure on screen as he cleaned his way down the executive hallway, parked his cart, knocked on Victoria's office door, then disappeared inside. The timestamp showed 11:16 post-meridian. 3 minutes later, paramedics burst through the elevator doors and rushed down the hallway. Then, police officers. Then, much later, Victoria herself, still in her evening gown. But what they found next changed everything. At 11:32 post-meridian, while Marcus was still in Victoria's office with Sophia, a different figure appeared on the stairwell camera. A man in a business suit moving quickly and quietly. He approached the medical supply room, used a key card to access it, and emerged 6 minutes later carrying 2 large equipment cases. "Freeze that," Victoria commanded, her voice sharp. "Zoom in on his face." The security officer complied, and the image expanded. The man's features became clear, unmistakable. Richard made a strangled sound. "That's," he started, his voice cracking, "that's Blake Morrison, my executive assistant." Jennifer was already pulling up employee records on her tablet. Blake Morrison, executive assistant to the VP of Operations, hired 18 months ago, previously worked in medical equipment sales. The room went dead silent. Marcus felt dizzy, the pieces clicking together with sickening clarity. Blake had access to Richard's key cards, his security clearances, his calendar. He would have known when the executive floor was empty, when the cleaning crew was scheduled, when opportunity presented itself. "Keep watching," Victoria ordered, her voice deadly calm. The footage continued. Blake disappeared down the stairwell with the equipment cases. Then, at 12:47 ante-meridium, he reappeared. This time, he approached Marcus's cleaning cart, which had been left in the hallway. Blake looked around, checking that he was alone, and then opened one of the cart's storage compartments. He pulled out something small and white, Marcus's time card, and took a photo of it with his phone. "He was documenting your presence," Jennifer breathed, her face pale, "creating a timeline that would implicate you." Marcus felt sick. He'd been set up meticulously and deliberately. While he was fighting to save a teenage girl's life, someone had been using his presence as cover for a crime. "There's more," the security officer said quietly. "We pulled footage from the previous 3 weeks. Blake accessed the medical supply room 4 other times, always during late-night hours when minimal staff were present. The total value of missing equipment over the past month is closer to $200,000. Richard had gone completely white. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I had no knowledge of this, none whatsoever. Blake handles my schedule, my access logs, my security clearances, but I never authorized—" "Then explain this," Victoria interrupted. "Jennifer, pull up the investigation timeline. When was the theft officially reported?" Jennifer's fingers flew across her tablet. The inventory discrepancy was noted on August 17th at 9 ante-meridium. The investigation was opened by Richard Castellano at 9:30 ante-meridium. Mr. Chen was placed on immediate suspension at 10 ante-meridium, and termination proceedings were initiated at 2 post-meridium that same day. "Less than 5 hours from discovery to termination proceedings," Victoria said, her eyes fixed on Richard like a predator watching prey. "That's not protocol, Richard. Standard procedure is a 2-week investigation minimum for theft allegations of this magnitude. Yet you fast-tracked Mr. Chen's firing so quickly that HR barely had time to review the case. Why?" Richard's mouth opened and closed. There was clear evidence, the pressure from the board to resolve this quickly. "What pressure?" Victoria's voice cracked like a whip. "I'm the CEO, and I gave no such directive. Who exactly was pressuring you?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Marcus watched Richard's face cycle through a dozen emotions: denial, fear, calculation, and finally, resignation. Victoria pulled out her phone and dialed. "Security, this is CEO Hartley. I need you to detain Blake Morrison immediately. He's to be escorted to conference room B under guard. Then I need you to contact the police. We have evidence of multiple counts of theft, and I want him arrested. Now." She ended the call and turned back to Richard. "You're suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation into whether your incompetence arises to the level of complicity. If I find out you knew anything about Blake's activities, Richard, I will personally ensure you never work in this industry again." Richard stood there, swaying slightly, looking like a man who'd just watched his entire world collapse. "I didn't know," he whispered. "You have to believe me, Victoria. I didn't know." "Then you're a fool," Victoria said coldly. "Either way, you're done. Get out of my building." Richard left the conference room like a man walking to his own funeral, his shoulders slumped, his expensive suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too large. 2 security guards flanked him, their faces professionally neutral. The door clicked shut behind them with a sound that felt like finality. Victoria stood at the window, her back to the room, staring out at the city skyline. The silence stretched out, broken only by the quiet hum of the air conditioning and Emma's occasional sniffles as she pressed against Marcus's side. Jennifer closed her tablet with a soft snap. "Ma'am, if you don't need me anymore, I should coordinate with legal and prepare the documentation for the police." "Yes, go," Victoria said without turning around. "And Jennifer, make sure Mr. Chen's personnel file is flagged. He's to be fully reinstated with back pay for every hour of his suspension, effective immediately." "Of course, ma'am." Jennifer gathered her things and left, offering Marcus a small, apologetic nod as she passed. Then it was just the 4 of them. Marcus, his children, and the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation who stood silhouetted against the window like a figure in a painting titled Isolation. Ethan tugged on Marcus's sleeve. "Daddy, can we go home now? I'm tired." Marcus opened his mouth to agree, to gather his children and escape this glass box that had held so much pain. But Victoria turned around, and the look on her face stopped him. "Mr. Chen," she said, and her voice was different now, softer. Less the CEO and more just a woman trying to understand something. "That didn't make sense. Would you stay for a few more minutes? Please. I need to understand something." Marcus glanced at Emma and Ethan. They looked exhausted, their earlier adrenaline fading into the sleepy confusion of children who'd been through too much too fast. "Ma'am, my kids." "There's a private lounge next door," Victoria interrupted gently. "It has a couch, some books, a television. They can rest there while we talk. It won't take long." Marcus wanted to refuse, wanted to take his children and leave this place and never come back. But there was something in Victoria's expression, a desperate kind of confusion that he recognized because he'd seen it in the mirror every day for the past 5 years. "Okay," he said quietly. "Just a few minutes." Victoria led them to a door Marcus had never noticed, hidden in the wood paneling of the conference room wall. It opened into a small, comfortable space with soft lighting and plush furniture, a far cry from the stark glass and steel of the conference room. Emma and Ethan settled onto the couch, and Victoria pulled out her phone. "I'm having my assistant send up some food and drinks for them." "What do they like?" "Pizza," Ethan said immediately, his eyes brightening slightly. "And apple juice," Emma added, "the kind in the boxes with the straws." Victoria smiled, and it transformed her face, made her look younger, more human. "My daughter loves those too." She typed rapidly on her phone, then looked at the twins. "I'll leave the door open so you can see your dad, okay? We'll be right in the next room." Emma nodded, but she grabbed Marcus's hand. "You promise you're not leaving?" "I promise, sweetheart. I'll be right there where you can see me." They went back to the conference room, leaving the door between the 2 spaces open. Marcus could see his children from where he stood, could hear the quiet sound of the television clicking on. It should have been comforting, but instead, it made his chest tight. How many more times would they have to watch him fight for their future? How many more times would they have to be brave when they should just be allowed to be kids? Victoria sat down at the conference table and gestured for Marcus to join her. He sat, his hands folded in front of him, the same position he'd been in an hour ago when he'd thought his life was ending. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Victoria asked, and there was no accusation in her voice, only genuine confusion. "When they accused you of theft, when they were about to fire you, why didn't you immediately tell them about Sophia? Why did you keep your promise even when it was destroying you?" Marcus stared at his hands. They were Janitor's hands now, rough and reddened from cleaning chemicals, the nails cut short and practical. They used to be a nurse's hands, gentle and precise, hands that saved lives. "Because I made a promise," he said simply, "and because I'm not a nurse anymore. I had no right to expect that saving your daughter would mean anything, in the face of evidence against me. Not a nurse anymore, Victoria repeated, and he could hear her mind working. But you clearly have extensive medical training. The paramedics said your assessment and intervention were textbook perfect. That doesn't just disappear. So what happened, Marcus? Why are you cleaning floors instead of saving lives? Marcus felt the old shame rising in his throat, thick and choking. For 5 years he'd kept this story locked away, had let people assume whatever they wanted about why he pushed a mop for minimum wage. But sitting here, in this room where his children had just fought for him with a courage he'd lost somewhere along the way, he found he couldn't hide anymore. I lost my license, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. 5 years ago, I was an ER nurse at St. Catherine's Hospital. I was good at my job. I loved it. It was everything I'd worked for, everything I'd dreamed of doing since I was a kid watching my grandmother die because the ambulance took too long. Victoria waited, saying nothing, just listening with an intensity that made Marcus feel both exposed and strangely safe. On March 22nd, 5 years ago, he continued, there was a massive accident on the interstate. 6-car pileup, multiple critical injuries. They brought everyone to St. Catherine's because we were the closest trauma center. 6 patients arrived within 10 minutes of each other. We didn't have enough hands. We didn't have enough equipment. We didn't have enough time. The memory rose up, vivid and terrible. The chaos of the trauma bay, the sound of monitors alarming, people shouting, the smell of blood and fear. Marcus closed his eyes, but it didn't help. He could still see every detail. I was the senior nurse on duty that night. The attending physician, Dr. Reeves, he was dealing with the worst case, a woman with a crushed chest and internal bleeding. He told me to triage the others, to make the calls on who got immediate intervention and who had to wait. Marcus's hands clenched together, his knuckles white. I followed protocol. You assess airway, breathing, circulation. You calculate survival probability. You save the ones you can save, and you don't waste resources on the ones who are too far gone. It's brutal, but it's designed to save the most lives. There was a young man, maybe 22 years old, head trauma, unresponsive, fixed and dilated pupils. By every standard measure, he was expectant. That's the medical term for someone who's too critically injured to save when resources are limited. I made the decision to focus on the other patients, the ones who had a chance. Victoria leaned forward slightly. You saved 3 lives that night. Yes, Marcus said, and his voice cracked. I saved 3 lives. But the young man I triaged as expectant? He died. And it turned out he was the son of Councilman Robert Preston, very wealthy, very connected, very angry. The family sued everyone, the hospital doctor, Reeves, the paramedics, and me. They claimed I'd made the triage decision out of negligence, that I hadn't properly assessed their son, that my judgment was impaired. He looked up at Victoria, and there were tears on his cheeks now. My wife, Claire, she died 8 months earlier. Childbirth complications. The twins were premature and her body it couldn't handle it. She bled out before they could stop it. I'm so sorry, Victoria whispered. The family's lawyers used my grief against me. They said I was emotionally unstable, that I shouldn't have been working in a trauma situation, that my personal loss had clouded my professional judgment. The hospital? Marcus laughed bitterly. They didn't even fight for me. They settled with the family and threw me under the bus, said I'd violated protocol, that I'd made errors in judgment. The state board revoked my license. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. I had 2 7-month-old babies and no job, no career, no future. I took whatever work I could get, warehouse jobs, delivery driving, and finally this, janitorial work. Nobody asks questions about a janitor's past. Nobody cares what you used to be. But you're still a nurse, Victoria said, her voice intense. When you found Sophia, you didn't hesitate. You knew exactly what to do. Instinct, Marcus said. Training. You don't forget that part. But knowing how to save someone and being worthy of saving them, those are different things. I let a young man die, Victoria. I made a choice that ended a life. What right do I have to wear that uniform again? You made a choice that saved 3 other lives, Victoria countered. That's not failure, Marcus. That's triage. That's medicine. That's the impossible weight that medical professionals carry every single day. Tell that to the councilman, Marcus said, his voice hollow. Tell that to the state board. Tell that to the hospital that decided I was expendable. The room fell silent. Through the open door, Marcus could hear the quiet murmur of the television, could see Emma and Ethan curled up together on the couch, Emma's head resting on her brother's shoulder. When you found Sophia, Victoria said slowly, you could have just called 911 and walked away. You could have protected yourself, maintained your invisibility. Why didn't you? Marcus looked at his children, at the two people who were his entire world, his reason for breathing, his reason for pushing through every exhausting day, because she reminded me of my wife, the fear in her eyes, the way her body was giving up. I stood by and watched Claire die because there was nothing I could do, nothing the doctors could do. I watched the light go out of her eyes while I held her hand and felt completely helpless. His voice broke completely. I couldn't do that again. I couldn't stand there and watch another person die when I had the knowledge, the ability to help. So I didn't think. I just acted. And afterward, I was terrified. Terrified that someone would ask questions, would dig into my past, would find out about my license and the lawsuit and everything I've been running from. Emma appeared in the doorway, her small face creased with worry. Daddy? Why are you crying? Marcus tried to compose himself, but it was too late. The dam had broken, and 5 years of shame and grief and exhaustion were flooding out. Come here, baby, he managed, opening his arms. Emma ran to him, and Ethan was right behind her. They climbed onto his lap, too big for it, really, but he held them anyway, held them like they were the only solid things in a world that kept shifting beneath his feet. You're not bad, Daddy, Emma said fiercely, wrapping her arms around his neck. You save people. That's what you do. That's what Mommy said you did. Marcus buried his face in his daughter's hair. Your mom said that. Emma nodded. I was little, but I remember. She said you were a hero, that you helped people when they were scared and hurting. She said you had magic hands that made the hurt go away. Ethan patted Marcus's cheek with his small hand. The sad girl isn't dead because of you, he said with the simple logic of a 7-year-old. She's alive. You did magic again. Victoria watched the three of them, this small broken family that had somehow remained whole despite everything life had thrown at them. She saw the way Marcus held his children, the gentle competence in the way he stroked Emma's hair, the way he carefully adjusted Ethan's crooked glasses. This was a man who'd been told he wasn't worthy of healing, yet he couldn't stop himself from doing it anyway. She thought of Sophia, who was home now, going to therapy, slowly learning to live with her anxiety instead of being consumed by it. Sophia, who'd written her mother a letter 3 days ago that said, I'm glad I'm still here. I'm glad I got another chance. Marcus, Victoria said softly, look at me. He raised his head, his eyes red and exhausted, his children still clinging to him. You didn't fail, Victoria said, and she put every ounce of conviction she had into the words. You made an impossible choice in an impossible situation, and you saved lives. The system failed you. The hospital failed you. But you, Marcus Chen, you did not fail. And 5 years later, when faced with another impossible situation, you saved my daughter's life. So I'm asking you, please, don't let their judgment define you anymore. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, then down at his children. I don't know how to be anything other than what I am now. Then we'll figure it out together, Victoria said. But first, we're going to get you and your children some food, some rest, and a future that doesn't involve hiding who you really are. The pizza arrived 20 minutes later, delivered by Victoria's assistant along with juice boxes, bottled water, and a plate of cookies that looked like they'd come from some expensive bakery downtown. Emma and Ethan ate with the focused intensity of children who'd burned through their adrenaline and now desperately needed fuel. Marcus tried to eat but found his stomach in knots, unable to process the last 2 hours of his life. Victoria had excused herself to make phone calls, her voice a low murmur from the corner of the conference room as she coordinated with legal, security, and the police. Blake Morrison had been arrested in the parking garage, attempting to load another case of stolen equipment into his car. The evidence was overwhelming, and Richard Castellano's career was effectively over, suspended pending an investigation that would likely end in termination or resignation. Marcus should have felt vindicated. Instead, he just felt exhausted, hollowed out from reliving his past, from exposing wounds he'd spent 5 years trying to forget. Victoria ended her call and returned to the table, sitting down across from him. The CEO mask had slipped entirely now, revealing someone more human, more uncertain. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer before you give it." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "Okay, what are you going to do now?" she asked. "You've been reinstated. You have your job back, full back pay, a formal apology from the company. But is that what you want? To go back to pushing a cleaning cart through these hallways?" The question hit harder than Marcus expected. 24 hours ago, the answer would have been simple. Yes. It was safe, predictable, invisible. But now, after everything that had happened, after his children had fought for him, after he'd been forced to confront the man he used to be, he wasn't sure anymore. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's all I've had for 5 years. It's how I provide for Emma and Ethan." "But is it what you want?" Victoria pressed. "Or is it just what you think you deserve?" Marcus flinched. The question cut too close to the truth. Victoria leaned forward. "I've been thinking about what you said, about losing your license, about hiding who you are. And I've been thinking about what happened the night you saved Sophia. You saw a person in crisis, and despite every reason to protect yourself, despite years of shame and fear, you couldn't stop yourself from helping. That tells me something, Marcus. It tells me that being a healer isn't just what you did. It's who you are." "I'm not a nurse anymore," Marcus said, but the words felt hollow now, like a script he'd memorized but no longer believed. "No, you're not," Victoria agreed. "But that doesn't mean you can't still heal people. It just means you have to do it differently." She pulled out her tablet and brought up what looked like an organizational chart. "I've been considering this for months, even before what happened with Sophia. This company has 5 campuses, over 8,000 employees, and exactly 0 dedicated health and safety infrastructure beyond the bare minimum required by law. We have security guards who barely know CPR, no coordinated emergency response plans, no wellness programs, no mental health resources." She turned the tablet toward him. "I want to create a new position, Director of Health and Safety. This person would oversee workplace safety across all our campuses, develop and implement emergency response protocols, train staff in first aid and CPR, manage our wellness initiatives, coordinate with local emergency services, and serve as a liaison for employee health concerns." Marcus stared at the screen, his heart starting to pound. "That's," he started, but his voice failed him. "A position that doesn't require a nursing license," Victoria continued, "but would absolutely benefit from extensive medical knowledge and experience. A position that would utilize your skills, your training, your instinct to help people. A position that would pay you enough to move your family to a better neighborhood, send your children to a better school, and finally stop living paycheck to paycheck." "Why?" Marcus whispered. "Why would you do this for me?" Victoria's expression softened. "Because 3 weeks ago, you saved my daughter's life when you had every reason to stay invisible, to protect yourself, to just call security and walk away. You didn't. You risked everything to help someone you didn't even know. That's not just training, Marcus. That's character. And it's exactly the kind of character I want in someone responsible for the safety and well-being of 8,000 people." "I don't know if I can," Marcus said, and he hated how small his voice sounded. "What if I fail? What if I make another decision that costs someone their life?" "Then you'll do what every other medical professional does," Victoria said firmly. "You'll learn from it, you'll grieve it, and you'll keep going. Because the alternative is what you've been doing, hiding from your calling because you're afraid of making a mistake. And Marcus, that's not living, that's just surviving." Emma had appeared in the doorway again, her face smeared with pizza sauce. "Daddy, are you going to get to help people again? Like you helped the sad girl?" Marcus looked at his daughter, at the hope shining in her eyes. When had he become someone his children had to defend? When had he stopped being their example of courage and started being their project? "I don't know, baby," he said honestly. "But you want to," Emma said with the confidence of a child who could read her father better than he could read himself. "I can tell. You smile different when you talk about helping people. It's your real smile, not your tired smile." "Out of the mouths of babes," Victoria murmured. She stood up and extended her hand across the table. "Take the weekend to think about it. Talk to your kids. Talk to yourself. But Marcus, please understand this isn't charity. This is me making a smart business decision to hire someone with exactly the skills and experience I need. You'd be earning this position. You'd be working for it every single day." Marcus stared at her hand for a long moment, then slowly reached out and shook it. Her grip was firm, confident, the handshake of someone who'd built an empire and wasn't afraid to take calculated risks. "There's one more thing," Victoria said as she released his hand. "Sophia wants to meet you. Properly, I mean. Not as an emergency, not as a trauma, but as a person thanking another person for saving their life." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "I don't think that's a good idea." "She wrote you a letter," Victoria continued, pulling an envelope from her jacket pocket. "She gave it to me 3 days ago and asked me to give it to you if I ever got the chance. I think now is that chance." Marcus took the envelope with trembling hands. The paper was expensive, cream-colored, and his name was written on the front in careful, artistic handwriting. He opened it slowly, aware that Emma and Ethan had come to stand beside him, reading over his shoulder. "Dear Mr. Chen," the letter began. "My mom told me your name. For 3 weeks you've been the man who saved my life, but I didn't know anything about you except that you were there when I needed someone most. I'm 16 years old, and I made a terrible mistake. I was scared and overwhelmed, and I thought the only way to make the pain stop was to make everything stop. I was wrong. I know that now. I'm in therapy. I'm learning to ask for help instead of hiding. I'm learning that having anxiety and depression doesn't make me broken, it just makes me human. But I wouldn't have gotten the chance to learn any of this if you hadn't found me that night. My mom says you're a hero, but she won't tell me much else because she respects your privacy. I just wanted you to know that I'm grateful. I'm grateful to be alive. I'm grateful for second chances. And I'm grateful that someone like you exists in the world, someone who sees a stranger in trouble and decides to help even when it's hard. Thank you for giving me a future. I promise I'm going to make it worth saving. Sincerely, Sophia Hartley." Marcus couldn't see the words anymore through the tears blurring his vision. Emma was crying too, her small hand clutching his sleeve. Ethan pushed his glasses up and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "She's glad she's alive," Ethan said softly. "Because of you, Daddy." Victoria cleared her throat, and Marcus realized she was fighting tears too. "She's doing much better. Therapy twice a week, medication that's actually helping, and she started painting again. Something she gave up 2 years ago. She's finding her way back to herself. You gave her that chance, Marcus." Marcus carefully folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. He thought about all the nights he'd lain awake, haunted by the young man who'd died, convinced that he'd lost his right to call himself a healer. But maybe healing wasn't about being perfect. Maybe it was about showing up, doing your best, and accepting that sometimes your best wouldn't be enough, but sometimes it would be everything. "I'll think about your offer," he said quietly. "And I'd like to meet Sophia if she's comfortable with that." "She is," Victoria assured him. "Very much so." 6 months later, Marcus Chen stood in his new office on the 35th floor of Hartley Industries and marveled at how much could change in half a year. The office wasn't huge, but it was his, with a window that overlooked the city, a desk that didn't come from a second-hand store, and walls covered with certificates from the training programs he'd developed and implemented. He'd taken the job. After a weekend of talking with Emma and Ethan, of walking through their cramped apartment and imagining something better, of lying awake staring at Sophia's letter, he'd called Victoria on Monday morning and accepted. The first month had been terrifying. He'd developed emergency response protocols for all 5 campuses, had trained over 300 employees in CPR and first aid, had coordinated with local fire departments and paramedics to streamline emergency procedures. He'd worked harder than he had in years, but it was different work. It was work that mattered, work that used his brain and his training, work that made him feel like himself again. The twins were thriving. They'd moved to a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood with actual trees and a park where kids played without parental supervision because the area was safe. Emma's asthma was under better control with regular access to her medications, and Ethan had gotten new glasses that he picked out himself, bright blue frames that made him look like a tiny professor.